Welcome to the second part of this video series. In this particular chapter, we're going to cover the different types of shelters you could use while backpacking. We'll look at some flat tarps versus pyramid tarps, freestanding shelters versus non-freestanding shelters, and we'll look at double wall versus single wall shelters. Additionally, we're going to look at what's called a ground cloth or a ground sheet, different options that help you protect your tent or as well as use with a floorless shelter like a tarp. And finally, we're going to look at some improvised shelters you might want to use more so for day hiking or in base camp and emergency. But with all this information, you'll be able to make an informed decision about what shelter works best for your budget, situation, even where you might be backpacking. So let's dive into the different shelters and we'll take a look. So this is among the most basic shelters you can have. This is a tarp, an 8x10 flat tarp. Very similar to the hardware tarp you might see, the classic blue tarp you might find in a hardware store. Doesn't matter the material, they're all basically set up the same way. This happens to be set up with what's called DCF, a very light, highly water resistant fiber. Doesn't matter about the fibers for now. The main thing is it's a classic tarp. There's many different ways to set it. As a friend of mine put it, these shelters are the origami of the shelter world. You can set up in many different configurations. The 8x10 tarp style A-frame is the very classic one. This is a modified version of that where the end is lower and this end is higher. It's best for one person solo, and it's called an A-frame so it looks like an A. Set up with hiking poles or sticks, some guy line here. And the reason why I like this shelter, it does take up a lot of room, relatively speaking, but it has great ventilation. This shelter is very good if you're going to cowboy camp, which we'll show later, and you're just going to set up a shelter temporarily, or maybe just on a rainy or drizzly night. So lots of airflow, lots of space for one. If it's for two people, you might set up a traditional A-frame style, but for solo, this is my preferred configuration. Keeps out the rain at the foot end, allows a lot of ventilation. I can tuck in more if it does start raining, and I can even cook outside very easily. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of room in this for one person, a little cozy for two, unless we set up a different shelter configuration. But what's really nice about this configuration style is you have a lot of space to put your gear, stay dry, etc. And you can tuck in back if it starts raining, if it blows in. If it gets windy out, you do have to set it lower so the wind doesn't blow the rain in. The major disadvantage of this shelter, at least for me, is it does take up a lot of space. It's a little more fiddly. It's the most versatile of all the shelters by far as far as setup, but it does require a little more elbow grease to get it set up correctly. The versatility, though, might be a good trade-off, and it's great if you're on a budget because a simple shelter, you don't have to get this expensive material. You can use all kinds of different materials to make a pretty good weatherproof shelter. People have even used these styles of shelter when it's snowing out if you set it up correctly. It's the classic shelter that can fit many different conditions, budgets, and made of all kinds of different materials, and it's been popular pretty much forever. So unlike a traditional tent, you'll also notice there's no ground cover here. If I'm camping in the nice needles or where it's really grassy, I find I don't need a ground cloth. And I'll explain ground cloths later in a little bit. But really sandy soil, again, like here in Utah, I'll actually use a ground cloth just to keep this very fine sand off the gear. Just so I don't get as dirty at the end of the day, etc. And it helps keep my gear longer lasting. Clean gear means long lasting gear, means gear that'll work for you when you need it. So that's the other thing about tarps and similar shelters. You may want a ground cloth, especially if it's wet or if it's really sandy like this. So this is the next shelter. This is a solo shelter. This is what my favorite type of shelter to bring when by myself. It's called a pyramid tarp. As you can see, it's shaped like a pyramid. There's many different basic configurations of this, but at the end of the day, it's a very simple pyramid style tarp. All that means, much like the A-frame tarp I showed earlier, it's just one piece of fabric. This happens to have bug netting sewed in, a little bit extra, just to keep out some insects and such. What I like about this shelter, the footprint is very small compared to a flat tarp. It sheds light snow very well, sheds rain very well. It's quick to set up. It weighs under a pound, so fantastic for solo backpacking. The disadvantage of it, there's not much room in it. As you can see, when wind picks up, you have to make sure it's staked out really well. And it's held up by one hiking pole as opposed to two. So pretty good structural integrity, but you really have to do site selection as well as stake it out really well. This is loosely staked just for demo purposes. In the field, I would have it staked down much tighter, but again, just for demo purposes, we're just gonna pitch it like this. So it's my favorite shelter, very light, small footprint, really meant for a solo person. They sell two-person pyramid tarps, but those are a little harder to set up, and again, it weighs more and not very easy to split up among two people. So this is the inside of the shelter. As I said, single wall, very minimal shelter, just enough room for one person and some gear. I don't have a ground cloth right now, which is just a piece of plastic sheeting. Painter's ground cloth is just fine. If it's a lot of pine duff, I won't bother the ground cloth. But as I said, the main advantage of the shelter, it's just a quick, simple setup, very light for one person. This type of shelter is best if you're hiking all day and just gonna make a quick camp at night and get up early in the morning. When I'm by myself doing some larger mile days, and again, I'm just camping, not really hanging out in camp, this is what I'll use. The footprint is very small, meaning it doesn't take up a lot of space on the ground, and it's not very spacious. You're not gonna hang out with a friend and play cards in this all night as you would with a car camping type tent. So if you're looking for a minimalist shelter, you can't go wrong with pyramid tarps. As I said, it's my favorite shelter when I'm going solo. So this is a two-person shelter made out of very light material. This is all one unit. It's called a single wall shelter. This happens to have bug netting built in it. As I said, it's 2.5 pounds. It's all one unit. So a little hard to break up with two people, but it's relatively compact and it's very light. And what I like about this, it has a big vestibule to store your gear, has a side entrance, and it has lots of mesh for ventilation, which you can fold up. Additionally, this is set up with hiking pole, which helps save weight. The disadvantage of this shelter is that you need some nice soft ground to set the stakes in. Hard ground, like a lot of Utah, a little harder to set in, or such places, the Rio Grande Recreation up the road from you all, a little harder to set up. Something like the Pecos or the Abajos, not too far from us, with nice wooded soil, a lot easier to set up. So 2.5 pounds, fits two people pretty comfortably, a lot of ventilation. This advantage of this is when it rains, you're gonna get more moisture in the tent if you don't make a nice tight pitch, and does wet out after a while, say 3 or 4 days in the rain constantly. So this is inside the tent. As I mentioned, this is a single wall tent, meaning unlike many of the car camping tents you're used to, there's no inner bug netting fly. This is just one piece of fabric. It makes it very light. A very tight pitch is very important to keep out the rain. These type of shelters work best with the tighter the pitch. Otherwise, you might get some condensation. Notice over here, there's lots of netting here to allow some airflow, and you can put up the vestibule when there's more airflow during the summer, keep out the insects, etc. It's a very minimalist tent. Unlike many car camping tents you're used to, there's no pockets up here for your headlamp or your smartphone, etc. There's just one accessory pocket here. This type of tent is just enough for two people. One person lies back like so, just enough for one sleeping pad. Your trip partner will face the other way, their head that way. So again, it makes a very simple shelter that's relatively quick to set up in the right soil, that's light and compact. The disadvantage of this shelter, again, it's single wall, so you might get some more condensation if you don't pitch it correctly. So this is probably more of a traditional tent, most of you know. It's a very compact two-person backpacking tent. It weighs 3 pounds. It's what's called a freestanding tent. Very easy to set up. Even this rocky ground here, like in Utah, where we kind of, again for demo purposes, it's what I call loose staking, just the rocks. But in any case, it's relatively light at 3 pounds, on the more expensive side. It's a 2-person tent, so the advantage of this type of tent is that you can easily split up amongst 2 people. And when we use it for backpacking ourselves here in Utah, I will carry the rain fly here and the stakes with 1 person, which will be 1 pound, and myself and the other person will carry the body and the pole. That'll be 2 pounds. So very easy to split up that way. And so this is what's called a double wall tent, which I'll explain in a moment, and it has the rain fly on the outside, unlike the one single piece of fabric with the lunar duo I showed just a little bit earlier. So if we go around to the side here, I'll show you what it looks like undone. It's the exact same setup on the other side was the vestibule. You enter the side, which is what most newer tents do. It's just enough room for 2 people, so you either have a very close friend or you're gonna get snuggled together over the night. But in any case, it's just a 2-person tent, very light. And if you go in here, I'll show you what it looks like inside. I have this foam pad set up, just enough room for 2 people. And you kind of lay down like this. And voila, that's inside of this tent.
Oh.
So this is why it's called a double wall tent. I took off the rain fly so you can see what it looks like without the shell. This is mainly mesh. And the nice thing about this is you can take, unlike the single wall tent, you can take off the rain fly. So you have more ventilation on a nice warm day. You can also, what's really nice, if it rains out, you're less likely to get moisture inside the tent. The major disadvantage of this, though, is that this is a lighter version, but most double wall tents tend to weigh, say, 4 or 5 pounds, especially for the less expensive ones. So everything's a trade-off. What's really nice about this tent, though, besides the double wall feature, it just sets up really easily. It's freestanding. You have a little more tolerance with staking. It's what we use together when my girlfriend and I backpack here in Utah. We nickname it the Wonder Tent because it sets up quickly. It eliminates a lot of stress in that when you're hungry versus, say, the other tent I showed before, which is nice and, say, a wooded, like in New Mexico mountains and the Pecos, a lot easier to set up in that kind of ground versus here. So every shelter has a trade-off. This is a more traditional tent, easier to set up. The double wall is really nice when it rains out, and again, there's a lot of insects. You still have a lot of ventilation so you don't get too hot. Cut. So as I mentioned, this is a 3-person backpacking tent. It weighs 7 pounds, which means it weighs more than 2 two-person tents. So it's actually more efficient to carry 2 two-person tents overall. I at least wanted you to see what a 3-person tent looks like. Right now we're going to look at the front vestibule of the rainfly. Just like the Big Agnes, this is what's called the double wall tent. The advantage of this tent, frankly, is more for car camping. 2 people can fit in this tent very comfortably. It's kind of heavy and bulky to have it by itself. If you look at the rainfly here, and again, these stakes are just for demo purposes. I would never put them this loosely in the field. You have a lot of room here for gear for 2 people. Pretty nice. And this is a little older style because most tents now have the side vestibules like I showed in the Big Agnes earlier. We're going over to the back here with the rainfly. The idea is the 3rd person will be in the middle facing out this way so they can get in and out very easily of the tent. Again, quite frankly, I find it better for 2 people this way. 1 person gets in and out of one entrance, the other person gets out of the other entrance. But it gives you a good idea of the size of a 3-person versus a 2-person tent. So as I mentioned, this is a very similar tent to the Big Agnes tent. I took off the rainfly. It's allows some ventilation, a little less mesh than the Big Agnes tent. You can see it's much, much wider than the other one. To give you a better view of that, I'm going to show you inside the tent where we have a foam pad just as comparison. If you want to follow me inside here, follow me inside the tent. very spacious. A palace for one, very comfortable for 2 people. Be a little tight squeeze for 3 in my opinion. Great for 2 people and a dog. We use this for car camping all the time. As I said, this weighs 7 to 8 pounds by itself, which is why we use it for car camping. And you're probably better off with those 2-person tents. It will actually weigh less and aggregate and be more comfortable for 2 people. My absolute favorite way to camp outside by far is cowboy camping, also known as sleeping under the stars. Now, it's not a shelter per se, it's just another tool in your shelter quiver. The advantage to cowboy camping, and again sleeping under the stars, is pretty obvious. It's just a quick way to set up. You throw down your ground cloth, throw down your pad, throw down your sleeping bag, and you're good to go. And equally simple breaking down a camp in the morning. But for me, it's not just about efficiency. It's just how much I enjoy it. You're just immersed in the outdoors. There's no nylon and bug netting between you and the world. You wake up in the middle of the night and the stars are above you, or you're in your sleeping bag, you're on that beautiful red rock of Colorado watching that stunning sunset while having hot chocolate. It's just a magical, wonderful way to experience the outdoors. Now, cowboy camping may seem a little difficult at first. We're so used to sleeping in a tent. So I encourage you to ease into it. If you have a traditional tent, take off the rain fly one night. Just sleep with the bug netting. And as you get more experience, more comfortable with that, try sleeping under some trees with some nice duff. It's a little warmer, a little more protected, and see if that's comfortable for you. As you get more experience, you may want to camp out in the open like some of these photos. Now, cowboy camping does require a little more of a skill set in terms of site selection and also reading the weather patterns. Luckily, the weather is reasonably stable out here in the West, but sometimes you can get caught in it, which is why I tend to cowboy camp when I'm taking a tarp, in particular Pyramid Tarp that I showed earlier, just because it is quick to set up if it should rain in the middle of the night. But give cowboy camping a try. It's just a great way to experience the outdoors, and it's something else to keep in mind. If the weather is warm, you just want to be outside, not in a stifling shelter. Give it a whirl, and I think you'll like it. So now that we've looked at all the different shelters, I would show you what it looks like packed. I have representation of what they might look like here, and I'm going to show you what they are one by one. This is the tarp. Notice how it packs down really small like that. You can't share it, of course, but this tarp weighs 7 or 8 ounces with the guidelines here, maybe 8 or 9 ounces, so very light. This is the Pyramid Tarp, solo shelter. Your clothing bag is probably larger than this. Very small, very light, 14 ounces, maybe 15 ounces with the stakes. This is a 2-person shelter I mentioned, the single wall shelter. A little bulkier. It does have these poles that are separate that you can split up, but it doesn't really shave that many ounces. So if you're going to split up the shelter, you have to do this. This is the 2-person tent. You can split it up like this, maybe split up the rain fly and then the body itself. But again, we're starting to get a little bulkier. Everything's a trade-off with shelters. And this is a little heavier than these guys over here. Finally, you can see why we don't use this 3-person shelter for backpacking much anymore. It's a great car camping tent for us, but it's very bulky, relatively heavy at about 7 or 8 pounds. You're welcome to take this if it's what you have, and you should use it. But given a choice, I'd rather take 2 shelters like this split amongst 4 people than 3 people, because 1 person's going to be stuck with most of it. So again, this is a nice visual representation of all the shelters I discussed, except for cowboy camping. Cowboy camping, as I mentioned earlier, is something I like to do with these 2 shelters more than anything. I only typically set these shelters up when the weather looks bad, because as I mentioned, I love cowboy camping. It's my favorite way to experience the outdoors. And that pretty much concludes all the different looks at shelters. I know I mentioned ground cloths a few times, so the next thing we'll look at is all the different ground cloth options and why you might want to take a ground cloth versus why you might not want to take a ground cloth. So one thing I talked about earlier when we're out in the field was the different types of ground cloths. Now there are many different kind of ground cloths, or ground sheets might be another word you might hear. All it does is protect the bottom of your tent from moisture, dirt, abrasion, and cutting. Modern tents are actually pretty strong, and some, myself included, say you really don't need them unless you're in some really sharp rocky ground, or perhaps again car camping where there might be glass around, unfortunately, or highly impacted ground or sharp objects. So here's 3 of the most common types of ground cloths that you might see as a typical backpacker. Now again, there's other ones, usually online, a little more deep dive, people really into backpacking, but I think these are the most common. You're very familiar with this, just a simple hardware type tarp, very heavy plastic. These are rarely used backpacking, and again, I debate if you even need one for a tent at this point, unless the ground's really hard. We'll use these a lot for car camping just because they're inexpensive, very durable. We're not as concerned much about weight savings when car camping. So again, just a standard hardware tarp, any type of discount store, hardware store, etc. This one is fitted for a tent. They range in price from $40 for some lower end tents all the way up to $100 plus for some higher end tents. The main disadvantage is they're very expensive. Debatable if you really need it for your more modern tent. They weigh somewhat heavy at 4 ounces, which doesn't sound like a lot, but all ounces do add up. But they are fitted specifically for your tent, so not a bad way to go. But in my opinion, the price and the weight makes it a huge, and the lack of versatility, because you can only use it for one specific tent, make it a huge ding in my opinion. The other common, and my personal favorite, is painter's drop cloth. It comes in everything from 2 mil, super thin, all the way up to 6 mil and beyond. So thicker thickness, if you will. It's relatively durable, different weights, as I mentioned. Cheap, you can cut it to the shape of your tent very well. I use these, as I mentioned, when I go tarping. Typically there's a lot of dirt, like in Utah, if I want to keep things clean. They can weigh anywhere from 2 ounces to 8 ounces, depending upon the thickness and size of it. The advantage of this is you can buy a roll for very expensive and cut a lot for very little money. Again, very durable depending on how thick a thickness you get. 2 other options I don't have available for me personally, because I really don't use them anymore, is a Tyvek ground cloth. You may see it around construction sites and scraps of it. Somewhat heavy, but very durable. It's kind of like Gore-Tex for houses. So it's waterproof, but lets moisture get out. And again, you can often find it free for around construction sites. Not a bad way to go either. The other thing that's very inexpensive and found in a lot of hardware stores might be the window film finish, or also known as the patio window finish. Any hardware store, very, very thin, roughly equivalent to 2 mil, if not thinner, of this. The advantage of that, it's very light, very inexpensive, not very durable. If I had to go with just one ground cloth, I thought I needed it, I would go with this for car camping. But for backpacking, just buy different thicknesses of this and different prices, and it's a good way to go, especially for a group of people. And that's my take on different ground cloths, and depending what you're doing, one might be better than the other.
I was asked some questions about improvised or emergency shelters. Typically, that is not really a consideration when backpacking. You have all your food, you have your tent or a tarp, of course, some warm clothing, some rain gear, etc. An emergency or improvised shelter is typically something of more concern when day hiking, where you're accidentally out for a night when you don't plan upon it. The only time you might need an improvised shelter when backpacking is if you're doing a base camp situation and you're walking away from your camp. In either case, be it day hiking or base camping, a simple emergency blanket, looks like a big silver tinfoil wrap for a burrito or similar, is very light, not expensive at all, and stows in the pack very easily. Another option, and one that works really well during cold weather situations in particular, is a Christmas tree disposal bag. There are a couple bucks at the hardware store. It's essentially a trash compactor bag on steroids. Pretty durable. I keep one in my ski pack, just a handy thing to have. Now, when most people think of improvised shelters, they think of the classic bushcrafter type shelters where you need a big knife and an axe and a pocket chainsaw to make. That is not really something we're probably going to do in this type of class or instruction session. Some people get a lot of enjoyment about that, and it can be a thing, but for the purpose of this class, it's not really in line with leave no trace principles that your other instructors may have mentioned, and takes a very long time to make one when there's other simpler things like the space blanket you can use instead. And again, if you're backpacking, you probably have your tent with you anyway. But still good to know about some of these emergency improvised shelters. And again, my personal favorite is a Christmas tree storage bag, especially if you have some warm clothing on you. It makes a snug, okay shelter for maybe an uncomfortable night, but will certainly keep you dry in the rain if need be.
And that was our take on different shelter options. Hopefully after watching this video, you'll have a better idea of what to take and what the pros and cons are of the shelter types depending on the type of trip you want to take. There's no best shelter, just what works best for you. Until then, be safe and happy trails.